My husband's funeral, Daniel Sullivan, ended on a cold gray afternoon. I sat alone in a small room behind the church, my eyes swollen from too many tears. When everyone had left, the family lawyer approached. He placed before me a sealed envelope and an old key, darkened by time. On the envelope were just 3 trembling, familiar words. For Maggie. I opened the letter with hands that were still shaking. It was the last message Daniel had left me. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. You once asked why, for 24 years, I never allowed you to set foot on Maple Valley Ranch. My final wish is this: never set foot in that place. But if you choose to go, you will find where I once lost everything, and there you will find the truth. As I read, my heart clenched. Tears streamed down my face, but my hand gripped the cold key tightly. I knew some truths could not be hidden forever. That very night, while the town slept, I drove my old car into the thick fog. My destination, Maple Valley Ranch, Alberta, and deep down I felt it was the place that would change everything. My old car growled along the cowboy trail as if it too were reluctant to carry me to a place I had never dared to imagine. The Alberta morning sky was a pale gray, thin ribbons of mist draped across the rolling hills like a scarf. On both sides of the road, wild grass stretched endlessly, dotted with lonely clumps of pine. Far ahead, the Rocky Mountains loomed, silent and immovable, like a stone wall guarding the secrets of this land. I drove in silence, hearing only the crunch of tires on the road and the pounding of my own heart. In my head echoed the trembling words Daniel had written: "Never set foot on Maple Valley Ranch." For 24 years, that sentence had been like a curse. I had asked him about it countless times, and every time he would simply take my hand, shake his head, and change the subject. I remembered a summer night in Minnesota when we were still young. We had been married a few years. Claire was only 3. I had dared to ask, "Daniel, why have you never taken me to see your hometown in Canada? I want to know where you were born, to show Claire what her father's childhood was like." Daniel, sitting at the dining table with a newspaper, looked up. His eyes darkened. He folded the paper quickly. "Never, Maggie. Don't ever set foot there." His voice was so stern I didn't dare press further. That night he sat outside on the porch for hours, finishing almost half a pack of cigarettes. I can still remember the flicker of the lighter in the darkness and his face sinking into a sorrow I could not understand. Now, as my wheels slowed on the dirt road into the valley, I realized I had been carrying that question my whole life, and now I was about to walk straight into the answer. A wooden sign appeared ahead: Maple Valley Ranch. Below it, a rusted iron plate, its red letters faded, but still enough to make me shiver. No trespassing. I slammed the brakes. The car jolted. My heart clenched as if gripped by an invisible fist. I drew a deep breath, but the chill spreading down my spine would not go away. This was the place Daniel had forbidden me to enter at all costs. I got out, walked slowly toward the gate. The wood had aged, tiny cracks etched across its surface like wrinkles of time. When I touched it, my palm met a cold dampness. Without warning, tears welled up. I whispered, as if to Daniel, "What have you been hiding from me for 24 years? Why am I standing here alone instead of us together?" Just then a hoarse voice came from behind. "Ma'am, are you Mrs. Sullivan?" I spun around. A man stood a few meters away. He was past 60, hair snow-white, sun-creased face lined deep, as if carved by wind and time. His eyes were both kind and piercing. He wore a worn leather jacket, his tall boots caked with dust. "I'm Thomas Green." He nodded gently. "I've managed this ranch since Daniel's father owned it." "I've spent my life here." Before he passed, Mr. Daniel told me, "If you ever came, I should open the gate and take you inside." I froze. Daniel had known there would be a day I stood here. I clung to Thomas's gaze like a lifeline in a rushing river. Finally, I nodded. He walked up, gripped the iron latch with both hands, and pulled hard. The hinge screeched, a harsh cry like a door of time long locked. The gate swung open slowly, heavily, revealing the dirt road winding deep into the valley. My car rolled forward, Thomas in the passenger seat. It felt as if I were crossing into another world. The road twisted between towering maples, the air filled with sap, damp grass, and the faint scent of horses. In the distance, the main house appeared. My throat tightened. It wasn't the ruin I had imagined. The sprawling wooden house had been quietly restored by Daniel. Gleaming windows, new roof shingles, wide open porch, at once old world and solid. I stepped out, legs trembling. Inside, the house still carried its classic soul. High wooden ceilings, a great stone fireplace in the living room, the faint resin scent of pine. Noon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long stripes across the worn rug. I walked down the hallway, heart pounding, until I stopped at a door with a brass plaque. Studio. I reached for the handle. It was icy, but Thomas shook his head gently. Not yet. Its time will come. We returned to the living room. On the oak table sat a silver laptop. On its lid, a small note in Daniel's unmistakable hand. For Maggie. My hands trembled as I opened it. The screen lit up. And then his voice came, whole, clear, warm, the voice of the man I had loved all my life. Daniel sat in an old armchair, behind him a room I'd never seen. He smiled, his eyes still alight with vitality. Maggie, if you're seeing me now, the journey has begun. I've prepared 365 days to walk beside you. Each day, a piece of the truth will unfold. By the end, you'll know why I never let you step into this ranch, and you'll understand why this place is everything. The screen went black, leaving the room in heavy silence. I sat there, tears streaming. My heart felt shattered, yet at the same time a small flame flickered to life inside me. I knew. I had just stepped onto a path with no way back. I sat frozen before the screen that had just gone dark, my heart still pounding after hearing Daniel's voice. That tone was so familiar, it felt as if he were still alive, just somewhere in this house, watching me through a crack in the door. I reached out and lightly touched the screen, my hand trembling as if trying to capture warmth from the past. Thomas set a cup of hot tea down on the table. Mr. Daniel worked on this for a very long time. He spent every last day preparing for you. I looked up at him. His eyes were steady, calm, as if to tell me I wasn't alone. I rose and walked slowly down the hallway. My heart led me to the door engraved studio. This time, Thomas didn't stop me. I turned the handle. The door swung open and sunlight poured through the windows, flooding a wide room filled with the smell of fresh wood and oil paints. Before me stood easels already set up, unopened jars of paint, brushes arranged in perfect rows. On the walls, Daniel had hung my unfinished paintings from my youth, the ones I had abandoned when I got married. I stood there stunned. I stepped into the center of the room, my fingers gliding lightly across a frame, feeling every scratch, every thin layer of dust. I realized this was the dream I had once given up. A studio to teach children to paint, an artistic space Daniel knew I longed for, but had never dared to pursue. He had built it quietly, as his final gift to me. The laptop chimed. I turned back. Another video opened automatically. Daniel sat in a familiar room, this very studio, only then it was still empty. He looked straight into the camera, his face at once gentle and serious. Maggie, if you're here, it means you found your own dream. I know you gave up your brushes, gave up your art for the family, but here at the ranch, I want you to take it all back. This studio is yours. But don't forget, this ranch carries secrets I've kept hidden, secrets about my childhood and about the Mitchell family. You must be strong, because the truth won't be easy to swallow. I stepped back, my hand clutching the edge of the wooden table. The Mitchell family. Just hearing the name made me feel the pain and anger that flickered in Daniel's voice. On the table, beside the laptop, sat a small file box labeled Water Files. I picked it up, but my hand faltered, unwilling to open it. Partly out of fear, partly because of a strong premonition. These were not just ordinary documents. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his eyes deep and grave. There are things Mr. Daniel wanted you to see at the right time. For now, you should rest. There's still much ahead. I nodded, but my heart was far from calm. I knew that little file box and the videos to come were the doorway to the truth Daniel had left behind. And once opened, there would be no going back. I thought I would have at least a few quiet days to clear my mind, settle into the ranch, and begin uncovering what Daniel had left for me. But I was wrong. They came sooner than I expected. That evening, the Alberta winds rose suddenly. Drafts slipped through the cracks of the doors, making the fire in the hearth tremble. I sat in the chair, trying to keep my eyes on Daniel's old journal, but I couldn't focus. His words from the video echoed in my mind. The Mitchell family will come. You must be ready. Then, the sound of engines, first faint, then louder, until headlights swept across the front yard. My heart jumped. Thomas, just returning from the stables, froze when he saw through the window. His face darkened. "They're here," he whispered. I stood, my pulse pounding. A black SUV pulled up to the porch. Its doors opened, and 3 figures stepped out. I recognized them instantly, though we had never met. Richard, Gregory, and Victoria Mitchell. Richard led the way, tall, broad, silver hair neatly combed, black suit perfectly fitted, exuding a cold authority. His face alone could make anyone feel small. Gregory, his younger brother, carried a thick file under his arm, silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, the look of a calculating lawyer. And Victoria, the eldest sister, her eyes sharp as blades, her lips pressed tight, every gesture dripping with contempt. They crossed the yard, as if reclaiming territory that was rightfully theirs. I heard the crunch of their shoes on gravel, each step pressing down on my chest. A knock thundered at the door, hard, impatient. I drew a deep breath and opened it. "Mrs. Sullivan," Richard said, his deep voice carrying the weight of command. "We need to talk." Gregory immediately thrust the papers forward. "This is a temporary injunction. Under Alberta law, the transfer of Maple Valley Ranch to you is questionable. Mr. Daniel suffered from heart disease for years, rendering him unfit to amend his will. The Mitchell family, we, have the right to challenge it." I looked down at the file, Daniel's name underlined. My chest ached. Victoria stepped closer, so near I could feel her breath. Her voice was low, but sharp enough to cut through me. "A widow. How long do you think you can hold on to this place? Claire, your daughter, might be wiser. She'll know the value of money." At the mention of Claire, my blood turned cold. I stepped back, but forced myself not to tremble. Daniel knew exactly what he was doing. This ranch is the legacy he left to me, not to you. Richard's mouth curled into a half-smile. "A legacy?" "Don't be naive, Maggie. Daniel never truly understood the law, but Gregory and I do, and if necessary, we'll let the court decide." Gregory's voice was cutting. "If you're wise, you'll sign this. Transfer management back to us. In return, we'll give you a settlement generous enough for you to live comfortably the rest of your life. This doesn't have to get ugly." I met their eyes, steady and unflinching. Live comfortably on your dirty money? I'd rather stay here and fight for this ranch than sell my soul." The tension snapped taut like a violin string. Thomas stepped forward, planting himself between us. He gripped his cane firmly, his eyes burning with resolve. "You heard her." Now, Leave Richard's gaze flicked from Thomas back to me, icy and deliberate. He said nothing more, only nodded at Gregory. They turned toward the SUV. But before climbing in, Victoria glanced back, her lips twisting into a cold smile. "Careful, Maggie. Claire may not be as loyal as you think." My heart sank. They had gone straight for my daughter. The SUV pulled away, leaving a storm of dust swirling in the night wind. I stood frozen, my legs rooted to the floor. Thomas laid a hand on my shoulder. "They'll be back, and next time, it won't just be threats." I nodded, tears brimming. Back in the living room, my pulse still raced. The laptop sat waiting on the table. As if sensing the moment, its screen flickered to life. Video 3 began. Daniel appeared in a dimly lit room, the light falling across half his face. His voice was lower this time, weightier, different from before. "Maggie, if you're watching this, it means the wolves have arrived. Don't be afraid. I've left everything you need to fight them. Starting tomorrow, layer by layer, the truth will unfold. You will understand why this ranch is not just land, but blood, water, and the lifeblood of an entire region. You must protect it. At all costs." I collapsed into the chair, tears streaming. But this time, they weren't only the tears of a grieving widow. They were the tears of a woman realizing she had stepped into a battle she could never walk away from. I couldn't sleep that night. After the confrontation with the three Mitchells, I tossed and turned on the big wooden bed in the main house, staring at the dim ceiling and listening to the wind lash the windows like invisible whips. Daniel's voice from the video kept repeating in my head, "The wolves will come." They had come, and they had not hidden their intent. Around 3 in the morning, I slipped out of bed, pulled on a heavy coat, and stepped onto the porch. The Alberta night was bone cold. My breath turned to white mist in front of me. Moonlight picked out the rippling snowfields like a sea of crystal stretching to the foot of the mountains. In the distance, the stable loomed, its gray roof tiles and small windows glowing with the warm yellow light of the oil lamp Thomas always left burning. I walked toward the stable. Each step in the snow clicked and crackled, as if I were treading on the silence of the whole valley. Inside, Daniel's 6 horses lay sleeping. Midnight, the black stallion, lifted his head, his eyes bright as embers, and let out a soft whinny that made my chest tighten. I ran my hand along his mane, feeling the quiet connection Daniel had deliberately left for me. Thomas appeared from a small room off the stable, carrying a lantern. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice hoarse but kind. "I feel like I can't sit still." "They'll be back. I need to know exactly what Daniel prepared for me." He studied me for a long moment. The lantern light carved deep lines into his face, giving him an expression of steady resolve. "It's time you knew," he said simply, then motioned for me to follow. He led me to a tucked-away corner of the stable where some old bales of straw were stacked. I watched, surprised, as he began to shift the bundles aside and uncovered a heavy wooden panel set into the floor. When he tugged it up, a narrow staircase was revealed, cold air rising from below with a smell of damp earth and metal. "This is what Daniel called the war room," Thomas murmured. "He built it after his brothers showed up without warning last year. No one knew about it except me, and now you." I drew a long breath and set my foot on the top step. The wood creaked, the lantern swung with each step. The rough earth gave way to concrete underfoot, cold enough to bite through my shoe soles. At the bottom, I stood in a narrow corridor whose raw concrete walls were lined with long fluorescent tubes. When Thomas flipped the switch, the tunnel erupted into harsh white-blue light that made me shiver. After walking perhaps 50 meters, the corridor opened into a wide room. I stopped, speechless. Before me was a battlefield of paper and maps. The main wall was plastered with geological survey maps, red pen marks tracing out underground oil seams, notes scrawled in Daniel's familiar hand. A long table at the center was piled with blue-covered binders, each carefully labeled Robert, Investment Fund; Gregory, Legal Files; Victoria, Insider Transactions. I stepped forward slowly, my fingers trembling as they skimmed the stacks. In one corner sat a desktop computer, its large monitor in sleep mode. Nearby were a printer, a small safe, and network security cameras. Daniel had built an underground command center, not unlike a detective's room, except there was only one target: his 3 siblings. Thomas set the lantern down on the table, and his voice grew grave. Daniel knew they'd never leave this place alone once they smelled value. He hired private investigators, accountants, even geologists to get proof. Everything stored here. I opened a binder. Inside was a scanned copy of the deed transferring Maple Valley Ranch from their father to Daniel. Properly notarized, ink still crisp. Tucked beside it were bank statements showing Daniel paid with his own account. No loans, no coercion. The evidence was airtight. The ranch was legally his. Another folder chilled me. Emails, minutes, financial reports, documents pointing to tax fraud and embezzlement that Richard and Gregory had been involved in for years. Daniel had quietly collected the pieces of the puzzle over time. I sat down and covered my face with my hands. After all those years together, I had never known my husband lived under such pressure and constant vigilance. Why did he carry that burden alone? I choked out. Thomas breathed deeply. He said you and Claire deserved a peaceful life. He didn't want you exposed to the Mitchell family's darkness, but he also knew there would come a day you'd have to continue. I looked up at the map on the wall. Red marks peppered the western slopes. The tract the brothers had conveniently snubbed in their proposal. That, it turned out, was where the richest oil deposit lay. Daniel had known, and he'd hidden it to protect me. Victoria's earlier taunt about Claire hit like a knife. They would try to pull my daughter to their side with money and the name of family. But standing in that underground room, surrounded by Daniel's evidence, I realized I now had what he had left me: the truth, the proof, and the means to fight back. On the table lay a blue envelope labeled in his neat hand. "For Maggie, if you go down here." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small USB drive. "Maggie, if you find this room, it means you're ready." This is what I collected, not only to protect the ranch, but so you and Claire will never be bullied by my family. I don't know if you'll fight or walk away, but I trust you'll know what to do. Remember, they are strong only when we fear them. Never be afraid, Maggie. Tears blurred the ink. I gripped the USB as if it were Daniel's own hand reaching across time. Thomas gave me a small, steady nod. "Now you have all the weapons. The question is, are you willing to use them?" I clenched my fist. A strange fire flared up inside me. Not just grief, but determination. I whispered like an oath. If Daniel built this place as a fortress, I will keep the fire. Maple Valley Ranch will not fall into their hands. Never. I returned to the main house with Daniel's letter still in my hand. Outside, dawn had broken over Alberta, the crimson sun rising behind the mountains, casting fiery light through the wide window frames. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the quiet air. But my heart was restless. It beat faster, as if it already knew something important was waiting. The silver laptop lay on the table, a single red rose placed across its lid. I sat down, opened it, and typed in the password. The day we first met, plus my maiden name. The screen glowed, and a notification appeared. Day 2, for Maggie. I drew a deep breath and clicked the video icon. The screen stayed black for a few seconds, and then Daniel appeared. Not the frail Daniel I had seen in his final days in the hospital, but strong Daniel, his face sun-kissed, his blue eyes blazing, his familiar crooked smile. Just seeing him like that made me break down in tears. "Hello, Maggie," he began, his voice so warm it seemed to shrink the whole room down to just the two of us. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. And I know. Maybe you're angry at me." He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "I deserve that." My hand trembled as I pressed it against the screen, as if I could touch him through the cold glass. Daniel continued, 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The doctors told me I had 2 to 5 years. I chose not to tell you or Claire. I was afraid of pity, afraid that every day would become nothing but a countdown. I wanted to live normally. I wanted us to still have quiet dinners, small trips, laughter untouched by fear. I bit my lip, choking back my fury as tears returned. All those times I had wondered why he seemed tired, why he vanished for months at a time. It was all clear now. "I knew you'd be angry," Daniel said, almost as if he had read my thoughts. "You have the right. But please understand, it wasn't because I didn't trust you. It was because I couldn't bear watching you suffer day by day. Instead, I spent my last 3 years doing something I never had the courage to do before. I came back to the ranch." He lifted the camera and panned it around, the very Maple Valley ranch I was sitting in now. But in his video, it was unrecognizable. Peeling paint, cracked windows, leaking roof. When I bought it back, it was ruined, falling apart. I thought maybe, by repairing it, I could repair myself, repair the past. And if I couldn't beat this disease, then at least I would leave you something lasting. My chest tightened. All those years together, I had believed I knew Daniel, a practical engineer, allergic to anything sentimental. Yet for 3 years, he had lived a hidden life, quietly rebuilding the place that had once been the hell of his childhood, only to turn it into a gift for me. He bowed his head, his voice lower. "I also knew my siblings would never stop. Richard, Gregory, Victoria, they've only ever cared about money. Once word of oil got out, they would come back. I gathered evidence, documents, everything is in the war room. But your greatest weapon won't be papers. It's you, Maggie. You're stronger than you think." I clenched my fists, seeing my own reflection in the screen. Strong? I felt tired, lost. But the conviction in Daniel's voice left me no room to doubt. He leaned closer, his blue eyes shining as though piercing through time. "For every day of the next year, I prepared a video for you. 1 year of companionship, 1 year of guidance, so you will never feel alone. Today is just the beginning." He smiled, the kind of smile that lit up the room. "I love you, Maggie. See you tomorrow." The screen went black. I sat there, tears flowing, but in my chest a different feeling stirred alongside grief, a sense of being lifted, supported. Daniel was gone, yet he was still here, in every image, every word. I closed the laptop, then immediately opened it again, as if afraid of losing his presence. His eyes lingered in my mind. A sudden knock at the door startled me. Thomas poked his head in. "Everything all right?" I nodded, my voice hoarse. He prepared a whole year for me." Thomas stepped inside, resting a hand on the back of my chair. "Daniel always believed you wouldn't just keep this ranch alive. You'd make it something greater. He said you were the only one brave enough to stand against the Mitchells." I let out a broken laugh through my tears. "Brave? I feel like I'm falling apart." Thomas shook his head. "Those who feel like they're breaking are usually the ones holding the front line. Don't forget, Maggie, Daniel chose no one else, only you." I sat in silence, his words echoing inside me. Outside, The wind moved through the maple trees, their dry leaves rustling like an autumn choir. One thing was clear. From this moment on, I could no longer be just a lost widow. I had to become the keeper of my husband's legacy, no matter what storms gathered on the horizon. And deep down I knew this was only the prelude. 3 days after I arrived at Maple Valley Ranch, I received the call I had always feared. That morning the Alberta sky was heavy and gray, clouds hanging so low it seemed they might collapse onto the mountains. I sat in the dining room, the laptop open and waiting for Daniel's next video, when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up. Claire. My chest clenched. Since Daniel's funeral, she hadn't called me once. My hand shook as I picked up. Claire? Mom. Her voice was hoarse, edged with fatigue. We need to talk. I smiled faintly, tears already filling my eyes just from hearing her voice. Of course, sweetheart. Are you all right? You're still in Boston, aren't you? There was a silence. Then Claire exhaled, weary. Mom, I just met Uncle Richard and Aunt Victoria. I froze. My heart dropped into a dark abyss. I bit my lip, forcing my voice steady. What did they say to you? Mom, they said you're holding on to something called Maple Valley Ranch. They told me you kept it from me. That Dad wanted the ranch left to the whole family, not just you. They said you're dragging me into a fight I never asked for. Her voice trembled, as if pulled between two forces. I closed my eyes, struggling to hold myself together. Clearly, they had moved faster than I thought. Claire, listen to me. Everything they told you is only half the truth. And half-truths can be worse than lies. But Mom... Claire hesitated. They showed me proof. Documents with Dad's signature. They said he wasn't in his right mind when he changed the will. I shot up from my chair, moving to the window, staring out at the white fields. Tears blurred my sight, but my voice hardened. Claire, remember this. Your father spent a year preparing to protect us. Do you really think he did all of that just to deceive us? You know him better than that. A heavy sigh came from the other end. I don't know who to believe, Mom. One side is you, the other is Dad's family. I feel torn in two. I pressed my forehead to the cold window frame, swallowing my tears. You don't need to choose right now. Just believe me on one thing. I have never and will never betray you. No matter what, I am always here. Before she could answer, a knock came at the door. I turned. Thomas stood there, his face tight. He shook his head and held up an envelope. I understood. The next video had arrived. Mom, I have to go, Claire said quickly. But I'll come to Alberta. I want to see it for myself. I almost told her not to, but stopped. Maybe only by seeing with her own eyes would she understand the truth Daniel left behind. All right. I'll be waiting. The call ended. I collapsed back into the chair, drained. Thomas placed the envelope on the table, his voice low. They've reached her. This is what Daniel feared most. I nodded, pulled out the USB, and slid it into the laptop. The screen lit, and Daniel appeared. But this time, he looked thinner, his eyes hollowed. The illness had clearly advanced. Day 6, Maggie, he said slowly. If you're watching this, it means they've reached Claire. He paused, breathing heavily, then looked directly into me. Don't blame her. They'll use everything, money, names, even blood ties to pull her away. But she's still our daughter. Never give up on her. I broke down sobbing. It felt as though Daniel were right there, reading every fracture in my heart. I know you'll feel weak, as if you're losing her. He went on, but Maggie, remember this. In the moments of trial, motherhood is proven. Claire needs you to be stronger than ever. If you let fear rule you, you'll lose both the ranch and your daughter. But if you stand firm, she will see the light. The video ended, leaving me in the sound of the wind shrieking outside. I sat motionless, clutching my wedding ring, filled with terror and determination. They had dragged Claire into their game, and I knew, from that moment on, the battle was no longer just about land or inheritance. It was about my daughter's heart, whether she would turn away from me or stand beside me in the final fight. That afternoon, the Alberta sky began to gather black clouds. Thomas had just finished watching the weather report when he turned to me, his face grave. "A blizzard is coming in from the Rockies. We need to prepare." I stood on the porch, watching the thick clouds swirl like a sea of ink about to spill over the land. The wind had already begun to howl, lifting thin layers of snow off the ground and twisting them into white spirals. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, I felt the raw severity of this place, and I understood why Daniel always called it a land that tested the human spirit. We moved quickly to secure the windows, stack firewood, and heap coal beside the hearth. In the stables, Thomas herded the horses into one wing, covering them with blankets for warmth. I followed, my hands trembling, not only from the cold, but from a sense that this storm carried more than snow and wind. Night fell, and the blizzard descended on Maple Valley Ranch. The wind roared like 1,000 wild beasts, flinging sheets of snow against the glass until the house shuddered. The power cut out. Only the firelight and a few candles lit the rooms. Wrapped in a blanket, I sat beside Thomas in the living room. Then came a knock at the door. I jumped. Who could possibly arrive on a night like this? Thomas gestured for me to stay put, then went to open it. A figure covered in snow stepped inside. Claire. She wore a navy coat with the hood pulled tight, her eyes wide and unsettled. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking. I rushed forward and pulled her into my arms. "Oh God, Claire, how could you travel in this storm?" She clung to me, her breath ragged. "I had to come. I couldn't take it anymore. I don't know who to trust. Uncle Richard says one thing, you say another. I needed to see for myself." I stroked her back, tears streaming down my face. "You came to the right place. Tomorrow I'll show you everything. Your father left the proof." But when I looked deep into Claire's eyes, I saw more than fear. There was a flicker of something else, a strange glimmer, as if she were carrying a secret. All night the wind howled outside. I led Claire to a bedroom to rest. Yet unease gnawed at me. I caught glimpses of her moving quickly through the hallway, her eyes flicking toward the war room. Near midnight, just as I was dozing off, Thomas knocked on my door. "Maggie," he whispered, "something's wrong." The war room door has been opened. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. We rushed to the stable, lantern light shaking against the walls, and sure enough, the wooden panel over the stairwell had been slid aside. "Claire!" I shouted, my voice breaking into the storm's roar. No reply. We hurried down the steps. The fluorescent light still glared. Papers were scattered across the table. And there, in front of the open safe, stood Claire. She froze, clutching a file, her eyes wide with panic. "Claire!" I cried, running to her. "What are you doing?" She trembled, her voice catching. I just wanted to know the truth. Uncle Gregory said Dad forged documents. I had to see for myself." Thomas stepped forward, his voice hard. "Or rather, they sent you to steal the files." Claire shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I'm not betraying you, Mom. I just can't stand being trapped between two sides. I need to know who Dad really was." I gripped her shoulders, looking straight into her eyes, and in them, I saw the real struggle, a 17-year-old child turned into a pawn in a game of power. My voice cracked. "Claire, I would rather lose everything than lose you. But if you give these to them, I'll lose both." She broke down, dropping the file to the floor. I wrapped my arms around her, holding on as if she were a fragile shard I couldn't let shatter. At that moment, the laptop on the table flickered to life. Day 7's video began. Daniel appeared, his face thinner but his eyes still bright. "Maggie, Claire, he said, as though he had foreseen this very moment. "I knew one day our daughter would stand at a crossroads. Claire, if you're watching, remember this. I was not perfect. I made many mistakes. But my love for your mother and for you is real. You must choose where to stand. But choose with your heart. Not fear, not money." Claire sobbed, collapsing against my shoulder. I cried too, feeling Daniel's presence still encircling us, protecting us even through the storm. Outside, the blizzard raged harder, snow battering the roof as if to tear it down. But in that cramped underground room, between my daughter's tears and Daniel's whispered words from the past, I knew this. The Mitchells had sown division, but they had not yet won. Not while I still had breath. The blizzard passed, leaving behind a silent, whitewashed Alberta morning. Snow blanketed the roofs, the roads, the maple trees along the ranch turned into frozen statues. I stood on the porch, inhaling the icy but crisp air, and I felt it clearly. A new chapter was opening. Thomas came up beside me, his cowboy hat shading half his face. He spoke slowly. "The Mitchells have spread word through town. They want to sway public opinion. There's a community meeting today at Alberta Town Hall." "You should go," I startled. "A meeting for what?" "To judge," Thomas said flatly. "Not by law, but by the will of the people." I understood. In a place like Alberta, community was the natural jury. They didn't need a courtroom, only trust and consensus. If the Mitchells won over the town, I and the ranch would be cast out. Claire overheard and stepped out from behind me. Her eyes still carried the confusion from what happened in the war room, but her voice was firm. "Mom, I'll go with you." We drove down the snowbound road, the tires sliding on patches of ice, the windshield lashed by bitter winds. My grip tightened on the wheel. I knew this journey was a turning point. Alberta Town Hall appeared at the end of the main street, a 2-story red brick building with the Canadian flag fluttering above. Outside, a crowd had already gathered. Farmers, miners, ranchers, their weathered faces marked by lifetimes tied to this land. I felt their eyes turn toward me as I entered with Claire and Thomas. Inside, the Mitchell family had claimed the front row. Richard rose the moment I stepped in, his booming voice filling the hall as though he were mayor. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Maggie Sullivan, the widow of Daniel, the woman who has brazenly stolen Maple Valley Ranch, a legacy of the Mitchell family, and more importantly, a legacy of Alberta." Murmurs rippled through the hall. I saw some nodding, others frowning. Gregory held up a thick file as he stepped to the center of the wooden floor, his voice sharp. "We have proof Daniel Sullivan was not of sound mind when he signed his will. Here is medical documentation from Boston confirming he had advanced heart disease. Could such a man make clear, rational decisions?" Victoria cut in, her gaze slicing at me like a knife. And meanwhile, Maggie, a complete outsider with no roots in Alberta, claims the entire ranch. She doesn't understand this land, this community. How can she possibly safeguard what our forefathers built? The atmosphere grew tense. I heard chairs scraping, whispers spreading like wildfire. My pulse raced. Part of me wanted to run. But then I felt Claire's hand grip mine tightly. Her eyes were still wet, but in them was a spark of resolve. I drew a deep breath and stepped onto the wooden platform. My voice shook at first, but grew steadier. "You're right. I wasn't born in Alberta. But Daniel chose me. For 24 years I stood by him through every joy, every hardship. He was not delusional. On the contrary, he was never more clear-headed than when he decided to restore Maple Valley Ranch." I pulled from my coat pocket the letter Daniel had left in the war room, holding it high. This is Daniel's own handwriting. He didn't just leave me a ranch. He left me a legacy of love, a conviction that this land could not be sold off to oil conglomerates. He knew the Mitchells, his own blood, would betray it, and he prepared me to stand here today to say this. The hall buzzed. I saw miners nodding, young mothers whispering to each other. Richard stepped forward, desperate to reclaim control. "Don't listen to her. This is a cheap tragedy play. She's just a weak widow clinging to vague promises. Maple Valley Ranch belongs to those who understand law, who understand the market. Us." At that moment, a chair scraped loudly. An elderly cattle rancher rose, his back bent but his eyes blazing. He pointed a finger straight at Richard. "Understand the market? We all know what the Mitchells took from Alberta. We lost land, lost jobs because you sold oil rights to North River. Daniel was the only one who came back, spent his own money to restore the ranch, to hire locals. And what did you do? You bled this land dry." Applause erupted, thunderous and unyielding. Richard's face stiffened. Gregory tried to cut in, but his words were drowned. For the first time, Victoria's eyes darted, unsettled. I squeezed Claire's hand, and she gave me a small nod, a nod that carried more strength than words. She was beginning to see the truth. The meeting ended in chaos, but the balance had shifted. As I stepped out of town hall, the icy wind lashed my face, yet I felt lighter. Alberta had not turned its back on me. They had become the natural jury, and at least in this battle I was no longer alone. I had thought the community meeting at Alberta Town Hall would make the Mitchell family back down, but I was wrong. Just 2 days later, I received a summons. They had officially filed a lawsuit against me, demanding Daniel's will be annulled and Maple Valley Ranch be returned to the Mitchells. On the morning of the hearing, I put on a simple black coat and wrapped the gray wool scarf Daniel had once given me. As I stepped out of the car, I looked up at the provincial courthouse, its white stone columns looming beneath the overcast sky. My heart pounded, but I told myself, Daniel had prepared me. I could not retreat. Claire walked beside me, her face tense but resolute. Since the town hall meeting, she had begun to understand more, but I knew doubt still lingered. The Mitchells had sown too many seeds of mistrust. Inside the courtroom, the air was so heavy it could be cut with a knife. Across from me, Richard and Gregory sat flanked by a row of gray-suited attorneys, their eyes sharp as blades. Victoria sat behind them, lips pressed thin, her gaze like a knife aimed at me. The judge, a stern-eyed man in his 50s, opened the session. Gregory rose at once, launching into his accusations. "Your Honor, we have proof that Daniel Sullivan was not competent when he drafted the will, leaving Maple Valley Ranch to his wife. Medical records from Boston confirm he suffered from end-stage heart disease and was under the influence of sedatives and painkillers. A man in that state cannot make clear decisions about property." My attorney, Helen Brooks, a petite woman with platinum hair and piercing eyes, stood. Her voice was steady and rang through the chamber. "Your Honor, we have evidence Daniel Sullivan was fully lucid. He recorded hundreds of videos, wrote dozens of letters, and managed the ranch's finances down to the smallest detail during his last 3 years. Could a man lacking competence create such meticulous plans?" Gregory snapped back immediately, waving his file. "But these medical records are black and white. They cannot be denied." Helen smiled faintly, then looked at me. "Mrs. Sullivan, please." I walked up to the witness stand. My hands trembled, but when my eyes fell on the wedding ring still on my finger, I steadied. I spoke of Daniel's last 3 years, of the videos he left behind, of the war room in the stables, the underground chamber filled with documents and strategies. I emphasized each detail, how lucid Daniel had been, how unwavering. The Mitchells stirred restlessly. Richard shot up, shouting, "Those videos could have been staged. Anyone can record something to deceive." I met his gaze directly, my voice sharp. "Staged? Then how did he know every scheme of yours? Every embezzled fund, every fraudulent contract? If he wasn't lucid, how could he gather such evidence?" Whispers spread like wildfire through the room. I caught the judge raise an eyebrow, his expression shifting. Then Helen held up a USB stick. "Your Honor, we request permission to present one of Daniel Sullivan's recordings. This will prove his state of mind beyond doubt." The screen lit up. Daniel appeared, his face clear, his voice firm and warm. Day 15. "Maggie, if you're watching, you may be forced to prove I wasn't insane. Here is the Q2 financial report. Here is the lease contract with local farmers, and here is evidence Richard falsified documents to sell land to North River. Show them who was truly unfit." The courtroom fell silent, the judge's eyes fixed on the screen. Gregory's face turned ashen. Richard clenched his jaw. Victoria gripped her chair so hard her knuckles went white. Helen turned back to the judge. "This is not just testimony. These are verifiable documents, signatures, dates, numbers. Daniel Sullivan was fully in control." A long silence followed. Then the judge's gavel struck. "Court will adjourn to review this new evidence." In the chaos that followed, I turned to Claire. She sat there, tears streaming down her cheeks. She whispered, "Mom, I believe you. I believe Dad." Those words pierced through the darkness in my chest like a ray of light. I squeezed her hand tight, feeling as if Daniel was smiling somewhere in that courtroom. But I also knew the Mitchells would not stop. They had lost one battle, but they would regroup. The greatest fight was still ahead, not just about legality, but about the survival of a legacy, of love, and of my family itself. The final morning of the trial dawned with Alberta glowing under sunlight after weeks of gray skies. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of tender green grass on the hillsides. As I walked into the courthouse, it felt as though I had just crossed an endless winter, not only outside, but within my own heart. Claire walked beside me, her hand clasped tightly around mine, warm and steady. In that moment I realized, whatever the outcome today, I had already regained the most important thing, my daughter. The courtroom was packed. Local reporters crowded the aisles, camera flashes popping relentlessly. The Mitchell family sat across from us, their faces cold, but their eyes betraying tension. Richard no longer wore his initial swagger. Gregory clutched his file, his hands trembling slightly. Victoria sat with arms crossed, lips pressed thin, her blade-sharp gaze unable to hide the unease creeping in. The judge entered, the gavel striking sharply. "The court will now read the verdict." Silence fell. My heart hammered as my fingers tightened around the wedding ring on my hand. The judge's voice rang steady, each word heavy as stone. "After reviewing all evidence, including videos, financial documents, and the legal deed of transfer, the court declares Daniel Sullivan's will fully valid. Maple Valley Ranch is hereby the legal property of Mrs. Maggie Sullivan." I nearly collapsed, tears spilling freely. Claire threw her arms around me, whispering, "We did it, Mom." Applause erupted from the gallery. The people of Alberta who had come to watch. They rose to their feet, cheering, as if this victory belonged not only to me, but to the whole community resisting greed. Richard growled, leaping up, "You'll regret this. The ranch is only the beginning." The judge struck the gavel again, cutting off his shout. "Order! This court has rendered its verdict. The session is adjourned." Gregory dropped his head, biting his lip. Victoria turned away, hiding the glint of moisture in her eyes, the first time I had ever seen her falter. I stood, holding Claire's hand, and walked out of the courthouse. Outside, Alberta's sunlight was blindingly bright. Thomas was waiting, his cowboy hat in his hand, a rare smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Daniel would be so proud," he said quietly. I lifted my eyes to the clear blue sky, my heart full of Daniel's image. I could almost hear his voice in my ear. "I believe in you, Maggie." In the days that followed, Maple Valley Ranch returned to its rhythm. Claire, Thomas, and I cleaned up, organizing the war room. We decided to keep it as a memorial, not just to Daniel, but to the truth that had saved us. Claire helped me play the remaining videos. Each day we listened to Daniel speak, sometimes about his childhood memories, sometimes about unfinished dreams, and sometimes simply saying, I love you, Maggie. I'm proud of you, Claire. Each video was a brick, rebuilding the bridge between us, mother and daughter. Then one day, in his final video, Daniel said, I don't want Maple Valley Ranch to be just land. I want it to be a place of healing. Maggie, open your art studio. Make it a place Claire can always return to, a home for the community. If I can't be there, let our love live on in every brick, every tree, I nodded quietly. And I did exactly that. Months later, Maple Valley Ranch had become something I'd never dared to dream, a home of memories, of art, and of hope. I opened painting classes for children from the town, even those once overlooked or abandoned. Claire stood beside me, running the music program. Laughter filled rooms that had once been cold. People from Alberta came to the ranch not just to work, but to find support. We hosted workshops, small exhibitions, even outdoor feasts when summer came. The ranch was no longer a secret buried by the Mitchell family. It had become the beating heart of the community. One afternoon, I stood on the porch watching children run across the meadow. The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the sound of their bright laughter. Claire stepped out, placing her hand on my shoulder. Mom, she said softly, Dad was right. This ranch isn't just a legacy. It's a new beginning. I smiled, tears falling, but my heart at peace. I whispered, Daniel, do you see? Your legacy lives. And I knew, somewhere in Alberta's endless blue sky, Daniel was smiling, at ease with leaving it all in my hands. If you believe that a true home is not built only from bricks and stone, but from love, courage, and faith, leave a like on this video. If you believe that even in the midst of snowstorms and betrayal, truth and compassion can still find their place, share this story so others may be inspired too. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tales so you won't miss the journeys where justice, truth, and love always prevail. See you in the next story, where every tear and every smile carries a lesson worth remembering.